I was reading an article critical of psychotherapy on aeon.co called Psychodynamic Nonsense. In it, the author makes an interesting comparison to highlight how we treat paid intimate relationships, saying that the therapist is somewhat akin to the sex worker. When you pay for therapy, the purpose of such a service is to practice opening up to someone and discussing sensitive subjects. Far too often do people forget this purpose and instead treat it as their only outlet for discussing all their black box topics. Obviously, therapy has other functions, but that's the one being focused on for this comparison. Like with the therapist, you are similarly paying for an intimate relationship, albeit a different flavor of intimacy, when doing business with a sex worker, and as such, the clientele of both makes similar mistakes when participating in these transactions. These interactions are meant to be tutorials to help you gain experience and become more comfortable with different kinds of intimate relationships. Just as the therapist is not a replacement for close friends and tough discussions out there in the real world, the sex worker, as the article puts it, quote, should not be there to replace the unwilling spouse, but rather to be the open-minded sex worker who offers different ways of being that can transform the real marriage out there. In both scenarios, clients are missing the big picture because their fixation on this transaction being the solution instead of the tool keeps them from utilizing what they've learned in their lives outside of these relationships. While I think this is a good comparison to highlight how we frequently use paid intimate relationships inappropriately, many people take exception to this particular comparison, saying it's not apt because the therapist is a medical professional. So what? The sex worker is a sexual professional, your point? It's in a remark like this, about professionalism, that a subconscious bias shows itself. This comparison doesn't make them uncomfortable due to lack of professionalism, but rather that they consider the sex worker to be of a lower caste in society than the therapist. It's an odd psychological function of leftists especially. On the surface level, they're all for vulnerable people, such as sex workers and drug addicts, having protections, resources, and respect, but in practice, still treat them as untouchables in the social hierarchy. There's a reason talk about subconscious biases shouldn't be ignored. There are plenty of people out there who claim to want what's best for addicts, but love watching them get beat up and abused by cops on television, or people who believe in housing as a human right only to grimace at the homeless person they saw on their way to work, or people who proudly say Black Lives Matter on social media, yet clutch their purse just a little tighter when a black man enters the elevator with them. If you're not willing to be an ally in practice, all of that flowery talk is nothing more than meaningless virtue signaling. Getting back to comparisons, acting as if the therapist is being denigrated when compared to the sex worker shows that you're still enforcing a social caste system. It demonstrates your belief, whether conscious or not, that a sex worker is an untouchable in that system. It makes it more difficult for you to see bits of yourself in these people, to truly internalize that their humanity means just as much as yours. This isn't the first time I've seen a comparison between two groups on different ends of the caste system upset people. Many years ago, during a depressive rut, I binge-watched a Vice series called Dope Sick Nation. It's about two former opiate users in Florida saving people from the streets and getting them into rehab programs. I loved the show because of how real it is. They're not afraid to show you that Frankie, one of those two aforementioned ex-addicts, still struggles with addiction. They're not afraid to show you that clean houses get kickbacks from rehab centers when someone relapses. They're not afraid to show you that some addicts don't immediately jump at a chance for rehab even if they get sponsorships. They show you that humanity isn't as straightforward as we assume, but rather messy and complicated. I love that. I don't want people to be given sanitized Sesame Street lessons about human hardship. Anyways, there were some aspects of myself during that rut of suicidality which felt similar to the experience of those addicts. Both addiction and suicidality are lifelong struggles. Even if you get over them, there's always the risk of landing in a situation so dire later in your life that the remnants of those struggles sing their siren songs. If life gets too difficult, there's always the easy way out. Doesn't sound too different from, if you're already at rock bottom, what's using your old-time favorite injectable coping mechanism gonna hurt? When I would mention to my friends how I felt similarities as a depressed person with the struggles addicts face, the reactions were always that I was talking down on myself for making such a comparison. Maybe they were even assuming that this was a symptom of my depression, self-deprecation, rather than a moment of empathy. It's unfortunate because these were friends who otherwise were very supportive of harm reduction policies and decriminalizing drugs, but just like the people who had a problem with the therapist and sex worker comparison, still harbor subconscious biases which enforce the social caste system they haven't fully committed to unlearning yet. Unlearning these subconscious biases isn't just about becoming a better revolutionary either. It's about being more in tune with the reality of human experience. One thing I notice when talking with Gen Z people is that they assume lifelong struggles are only for the untouchables like drug addicts and felons. So when they encounter a lifelong struggle such as disability, they assume that they're profoundly broken and alone. The social conditioning they refuse to unlearn has convinced them that they have no allies out there to understand their struggles because they've been labeled as untouchables you're forbidden from having empathy with. It's self-destructive. I promise you that no matter what you're going through, plenty of people out there right now are going through something similar that you can find relatable. You just have to unlearn those subconscious biases and look for them. These people didn't just begin existing when you did either. They were here long before you as well. When I began my journey to unlearn the sexual shame that had built up from years of seeing kink-negative comments during highly reactionary times in internet and American history, one thing that helped me feel catharsis was learning about the girth and mirth gay subculture that started in the 70s. This was not only cathartic, but also entertaining. There's something wholesomely funny about reading their zines and publications from the time and watching them make some of the same jokes and quips me and my massive boyfriend make today. Even outside of kink, there's something personally liberating about reconnecting with queer history in general. I know people love to joke, in Germany it's 8 p.m., in France it's 7, and in America it's the 1980s, but that makes me wonder, what did oppressed queer people do in the 1980s? And that led me to learning about inspiring gay people like Keith Haring, who used his eye-catching art style throughout his career to bring attention to touchy political issues like the AIDS crisis. I also learned about underground queer clubs like the Paradise Garage and the culture surrounding third spaces for queer people in general during those times. During my search for more inspiring and relatable people from history, I found this hilarious picture of a gay man wearing a shirt in protest of a homophobic anti-sodomy law in Maryland. While we are experiencing similar civil rights struggles to our predecessors, it helps to empathize instead of relegating them to an irrelevant class within the social caste system. These people upheld queer artists and their transformative works. They congregated with other queer people, whether it was at red light districts, basement clubs, or the seedy gay bar. They fought for their rights, but had a sense of fun to it. If you're always fighting for your rights, make it something you enjoy doing. Even if you're not an 80s kid, there's something to be learned from queer people alive during those times. Even if you've never been an addict, someone who went through that experience can empathize with your flavor of lifelong struggle. The best communities I've ever been in are ones where transgender sex workers, Therians with tulpas, and autistic non-binary furries are all being expressive and open while sharing fetishy smut and niche music on the sidelines. So what I'm about to say comes from years of experience. You will never be too weird for empathy. Ever.